As the Good Morning America broadcast began, and George Stephanopoulos welcomed Meghan Markle to the studio, there was already a charged energy in the air. Meghan appeared calm and poised, ready to promote her new humanitarian campaign, but George had other intentions. Starting off by acknowledging her work before immediately shifting the topic to her public controversies with a neutral tone. He asked whether she truly believed her narrative still resonated with people, given how often it revolved around personal grievances. Meghan hesitated for a moment, before confidently asserting that her story was one of strength and survival. George then asked whether constantly revisiting the past might undercut the credibility of her present message. Meghan maintained that the past must be addressed before healing can happen. George responded that many critics believed she had turned personal pain into public performance and questioned if it was fair to demand empathy while showing little tolerance for criticism. The atmosphere began to tighten as Meghan defended her right to speak her truth. George leaned in slightly and brought up her well-known interviews. Noting that each one seemed to contain new revelations or accusations, he asked if she understood why some audiences felt overwhelmed or skeptical. Meghan calmly said that if people were uncomfortable hearing the truth, that discomfort wasn't her burden. George countered by suggesting that constantly controlling the narrative while refusing certain questions came across as selective transparency. Meghan pushed back, stating that she had every right to choose how she shared her story and that silence was no longer an option. George then asked if she ever considered how this media approach may have eroded public sympathy. Meghan said that focusing on public perception was not her goal, and that the only thing that mattered was standing in authenticity. George looked at her firmly and said authenticity also required accountability, especially when one occupies a platform of immense privilege. Meghan's face remained still, but her voice carried a sharper edge as she responded. Conversation took another tense turn as George asked whether Meghan's partnership deals with streaming giants contradicted her earlier criticism of media exploitation. Meghan explained that her goal was to reclaim her narrative through creative control and thoughtful content. George raised his eyebrows and remarked that for someone who disapproved of the spotlight, she seemed remarkably good at monetizing it. Meghan frowned and said it was hypocritical to shame someone for building a livelihood after being cut off from institutional support. George remarked that this was exactly the contradiction many people struggled with, wanting freedom from the system while profiting from its fame. Meghan responded that she never asked for fame, and that surviving the system didn't make her indebted to it. George then asked if her choices had unintentionally weakened the credibility of genuine activism by making it seem commercialized. Meghan looked visibly offended and stated that her work stood on its own merit and didn't need validation from critics. As the discussion intensified, George shifted toward the topic of public trust and asked whether Meghan felt she had contributed to the erosion of confidence in institutions like the monarchy and traditional media. Meghan said her aim was never destruction but evolution. George replied that evolution requires collaboration, not exile. Meghan sharply responded that collaboration wasn't possible in a space where her voice was constantly diminished. George then brought up the fallout with her father and asked if making such private matters public helped or harmed her own message of healing. Meghan bristled and said family betrayal should never be used as a tabloid weapon. George retorted that she herself had participated in bringing those matters into public view. Meghan tried to argue that public exposure was forced upon her, but George interrupted and said that at a certain point she chose to participate in the same cycle she claimed to condemn. The silence between them was thick as both clearly refused to yield ground. Tempting to continue on the same note, George brought up Meghan's past claims of being silenced and asked why. If she had truly been silenced, she had since spoken in more interviews than most global leaders. Meghan's expression hardened as she responded that being silenced is about fear and consequence, not the absence of speech. George raised his voice slightly and said that some viewed her continued appearances as more self-promotion than bravery. Meghan rejected that notion and said it took courage to be vulnerable under relentless judgment. George asked whether she could see why people might become cynical about her intentions. Meghan fired back that people become cynical when media teaches them to be, and that truth should never be mistaken for self-interest. George nodded but added that timing and presentation matter, and that overexposure could cause even valid messages to lose impact. Meghan narrowed her gaze and said, if people tuned out, that was their choice, not her responsibility. The discussion then turned toward the couple's departure from royal life. George asked if Harry and Meghan had fully considered the long-term impact of leaving the institution in such a dramatic and public manner. Meghan said that staying would have meant emotional and mental harm, and that the decision wasn't made lightly. George asked if she truly believed they had no other recourse. Meghan replied that every private attempt failed and they were left with no choice. George asked if she thought it was helpful to label the royal family as part of the problem without offering room for reconciliation. Meghan said truth was not conditional on comfort. George said many interpreted their departure as a rebellion, not a reform. Meghan said change doesn't always look polite, and George retorted that it shouldn't look calculated either. Meghan's jaw clenched, and she said the real calculation was surviving a system built to silence dissent. George smiled slightly and asked whether she believed she had now become what she once opposed. The audience watched in growing discomfort. George questioned Meghan's new children's initiatives and whether those projects were overshadowed by the controversies surrounding her personal life. Meghan said the two were unrelated and that the media chose what to amplify. George replied that impact cannot be separated from image and asked if her public persona helped or hurt the causes she championed. Meghan insisted that children benefiting from education or nourishment don't care about headlines. George said donors do, and so does long-term sustainability. Meghan said anyone who withdraws support over false headlines was never truly committed. George leaned forward and asked whether she felt burdened by the responsibility of her name or empowered by it. Meghan answered both. George followed up by asking if she had ever thought of living entirely out of the spotlight. Meghan answered that invisibility was never a solution for someone who has a voice and a mission. George said sometimes silence is not surrender, but maturity. Meghan gave a dry laugh at that remark. George pushed further, asking whether she had ever sincerely reflected on how her public actions might be perceived outside of her own framework. Meghan replied that it wasn't her job to conform to everyone's expectations. George asked if that attitude hindered understanding. Meghan countered by saying understanding is a two-way street. George said it was hard to meet in the middle when one side publishes documentaries and books. Meghan replied that speaking your truth in your own way wasn't an attack on others. George questioned whether her truth included room for other people's versions of events. Meghan's tone sharpened as she said she had never denied anyone else their voice. George then said, but you've often spoken before they had a chance to. Meghan was visibly agitated and said she would not apologize for choosing to speak when she felt silenced for too long. George nodded and said, but sometimes the loudest voice isn't the most honest. The audience murmured as tension reached its peak. Then came the breaking point. George asked if Meghan believed that in some ways she had become a symbol of the very media machine she once fought against. Meghan looked stunned and said that was a cruel accusation. George replied that symbolism isn't always voluntary, but it's always powerful. Meghan's voice rose as she said she refused to be reduced to a headline or a symbol. George calmly responded that the world doesn't always respect our refusal. Meghan stood her ground and said she would rather be judged for speaking than praised for silence. George said perhaps, but if everyone's always wrong and she's always right, that's not truth. It's theater. Meghan took a breath, then said perhaps it's easier to call it theater than to confront what makes you uncomfortable. George replied that wasn't discomfort, it was clarity. Meghan stood up, clearly unwilling to continue the exchange, and told George that what he was doing wasn't journalism, it was performance. The studio fell into an uneasy silence as Meghan walked off the set. Staff looked on in disbelief and the live broadcast scrambled to cut to commercial. George remained seated, his expression unchanged. He thanked the viewers and briefly acknowledged that passionate conversations can become difficult ones, but said the questions he asked were necessary. The internet erupted almost instantly, with clips flooding social media and viewers split in their reactions. Some said George had gone too far, while others praised him for pushing back on what they called curated narratives. Hashtags trended within the hour, and media outlets raced to summarize the explosive walkout. Meghan's team released a brief statement saying she would not engage with host